I would like religion to be true. I'd like it to be true, because I'd like there to be immortality. I'd like there to be rewards for those who've been virtuous and punishments for those who've not been virtuous. Especially the punishments would be good. You know, there's no justice in this world, and it would be good if there was some cosmic force that distributed justice in the proper way that it should be. And it still is, to me, a constant source of irritation and pain that wicked people prosper and virtuous people don't. So there was a bit of disappointment about those aspects of it. But there was some exhilaration too. I mean, Russell has a description which I think is kind of appropriate of a feeling of a godless universe is a kind of exhilarating universe. There's something hygienic about it. There's something bracing about it. Whereas the idea that there's this sort of suffocating presence gazing at your every movement and thought, you know, and gauging everything you do, and it's a bit oppressive to think that way.
Well, okay. Now here you are, the philosopher that you thought you might become.
Yeah.
You have now very fully become. Now, in your role as a philosopher, I'd love you to develop the arguments which were previously simply intuitional skin shedding.
Yeah.
Now be more systematic and surgical about
Yes.
it, and say
Yes.
why, in fact,
Yes.
the notion of a God.
Well,
Incredible.
the one set of arguments is the sort of no evidence arguments. Russell puts it by saying there's no more reason to believe in the Christian God than the Greek gods. No more reason to believe. In other words, there's no positive evidence for it. I mean, there's no theory that you need to postulate God in to explain some natural phenomenon which can't be explained by some other theory. People sometimes will say, well, miracles were performed. There's never any good evidence that miracles were performed. The judgment that they were is usually based on a prior opinion that God exists rather than being an independent source for believing that God exists. So there's no evidence in terms of what anybody's ever observed. There's no fact about the world that can't be explained without postulating God. So there's no reason to believe in God, any more than there's any reason to believe in Zeus or any of the Greek gods. So that's on the side of whether there's any reason to believe it. There's the question now, are there reasons to disbelieve it? Are there any positive arguments against it? There are also some arguments for, like the ontological argument, when we talk about the ontological argument.
Well, tell us what that argument is.
The ontological argument. This is a very nice argument. Anselm of Canterbury thought of it. I think it must be in the 15th century. He argued that the definition of God entails that God exists. Now this would be a fantastic result, right, if that just the mere definition tells that God exists. So what's the definition of God? The most perfect conceivable being, or let's say the most powerful conceivable being is an equally good way of putting it. And then Anselm argues as follows. Well, suppose this most powerful or most perfect being did not exist, right? Then he would lack the attribute of existence. But the attribute of existence is one of the perfections, or one of the things which makes a being powerful. But since he is by definition the most perfect being, he must have the attribute of existence. Therefore God exists. Right, so let's go over the argument again. Get the definition of God. How is God to be defined? Let's compare this with the unicorn. Well, how is a unicorn to be defined? A unicorn is a horse with a horn growing out the middle of its head. There's nothing in that definition to imply that unicorns exist, and unicorns don't exist. But let's define God, right? An all-powerful, all-good, all-knowing being, right? These are some of his characteristics. And everybody will agree that's the definition of God. So now one of the definitions is he's the most perfect being. One of his attributes is utmost perfection, unimprovable perfection. Okay, that's the definition of God. Now Anselm argues that if God didn't exist, wouldn't he be less perfect than a being just like him in all those attributes, except that that being existed? Because to exist is to be more perfect than not to exist. It's better to exist than not to exist. God is as good as you can be, as superior as you can be, so he must exist. So we know by definition that God exists. It's a brilliant argument, right? But it's wholly unconvincing to everybody who hears it. They think there's something going wrong with that, you know. That's a very strange argument.
All right, tell us what's wrong with it.
The difficulty is nobody's ever managed to pinpoint exactly what's wrong with it. I'll tell you what I think is wrong with it, though the issue is not by no means clear. I think what's very funny in the bit that strikes you as sophistical is the bit that says, God's the most perfect, existence is one of the perfections. It sounds superficially plausible, but what does it really mean? Right? It's one of the perfections. I like to compare this to somebody who said, let's take the most tasty meal conceivable. The most tasty meal conceivable. Does that mean anything to say that? This is the most tasty meal I've ever had, but it's not well defined. The most tasty meal conceivable, or the best football game conceivable. Not that I've ever seen. What does it mean then? I mean, it's not a very clearly meaningful idea. So if we say we're defining God as the most perfect being, and we don't really lay down very clearly what we mean by perfect,